Hello, everyone. Welcome. We have a presentation today from Brian Birch from the Financial Aid Office at Binghamton University. He is the Associate Director, and he is going to be talking to us today about FAFSA. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we will definitely get to them at the end of this presentation. But yeah, with that said, I'm just going to turn it over to Brian. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks to everybody attending.
Thank you, Sophia, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit about the FAFSA process. So we're going to talk about the application, what the FAFSA is, different types of financial aid. If you have any questions, there is a chat feature that you can put your question into, and we will address it probably towards the end of the presentation. So I'm anticipating maybe 20-25 minutes worth of presentation material, and then time for question and answers afterwards. So with that, let's get started. So here's our agenda. We're going to talk about these things. What is financial aid? Who is eligible? How and when do I apply? How do I know if I'm eligible? And some other tips and other helpful information. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is financial aid? Financial aid consists of four components. The first one is grants. Grants are usually free money that does not have to be paid back. They are usually based on need. Now, every family has some type of need, but that need is actually determined by filling out the FAFSA. An example of a grant would be the federal Pell Grant, P-E-L-L. A lot of schools, universities have other types of institutional grants that they offer to students. And the good thing about this presentation is a lot of this information is going to be relevant to any school that the student might be attending. So financial aid is pretty universal across all colleges and universities in the US. Excuse me. The next component are loans. Loans, as they imply, are funds offered to students to help cover the cost of their education. These loans do have to get paid back, usually when the student stops attending or graduates. Tomorrow, we're actually having a loan presentation as well. So if you want to come back and we'll give you some more information, more an in-depth dive on loans, please feel free. The next component of financial aid is employment. It's also referred to as federal work study. So federal work study allows the student to work on campus and earn a paycheck. The money isn't really designed to help with tuition. It's designed to give the student money for books, money to spend on supplies. Maybe the student's going to go off campus for a night out, or whatever the student really needs. They can earn money by this federal work study option. So the paycheck does go directly to the student, but the money does not come off the bill. And what I mean by that is students and parents will receive a financial aid award letter from the college. On that award letter could be the federal work study option. Because colleges pay students for working, we can't take it off the bill at the same time. So the hours, usually around 10 to 15 hours a week is what's recommended. It is not a part-time job where students can work 25, 30 hours a week. It's designed to fit around the student schedule and to give them some extra spending money. The last component are scholarships. Scholarships are free money. Usually they are merit-based, not always, but a lot of times when a student applies to a college or university, the admissions office will evaluate their application and then award a merit-based scholarship based on class rank, the application, SAT scores, and other criteria. So let's start off with who is actually eligible for federal aid. And these are for the major requirements. They must be admitted into a degree-seeking program. Matriculated means that they are actually in a program to earn either an associate's or a bachelor's degree. The student must be a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen. For males, they need to be registered with Selective Service and must not have any drug-related felony convictions. So the government believes that it is a responsibility for both the parent and student to help pay for college. Thus, when we go to fill out the FAFSA, which we'll talk about in a little bit, we do need the parent as well as student information. So there is two separate sections for each, the parent and the student. One is a financial section and one is a demographic. So we do need both the parent and the student to complete the FAFSA. Sometimes we come upon a divorce or separation situation. So in that case, the parent who the student lives with is the one that would put their name and information on the FAFSA. In a joint custody situation, the parent who provides the most support, so typically who the student lives with more than 50% of the time. And here's one thing that a lot of people kind of misconstrue. For remarried situations, the parent as well as the step parent must complete the FAFSA. So the FAFSA is looking for household information. So if mom or dad happens to remarry, that step parent's information would need to be included on the FAFSA, even if they don't have any legal liability to provide support for the student. The FAFSA does still require both parents' information in a remarried circumstance. Okay. A lot of students will ask, well, how am I considered independent? There are two classifications of students for FAFSA. One is dependent and one is independent. So there are a series of questions on the FAFSA that if the student answers yes to any of these questions, they are considered independent. What that means is that they do not need to provide their parents' information. So here are generally the questions asked on the FAFSA that would make a student independent. Born before January 1st, 1997. Now that date is going to change depending on the aid year that you're filling out the FAFSA. So that's the question, or rather, sorry, the birth date for this academic year, 2021. So if you're not looking to do the FAFSA till next year or even the following year, that born before date will change. Is a student married? Are they working on a master's or doctorate program? Are they serving in the armed forces, or are they a veteran? Does the student have children? They must prove that they are providing more than 50% support for that child. So there are times when a student will be applying, has a child, but might live with their parents. So in that case, the student would need to document that they are providing more than 50% support in terms of housing, food, medical bills. So that would need to be provided as well. Is a student an orphan, ward of the court, possibly an emancipated minor, in a legal guardianship, or sometimes in a homeless situation? So if the student answers yes to any of these questions, one, they should be able to provide proof, and two, they will then be considered independent, where mom and dad does not have to put in any of their information. Okay. All right, so let's start with how we apply. So the first step is both the student and parent need to obtain what's called an Fsa Id. There's the link. The website is just fsaid.ed.gov, or if you just Google FSA ID, it'll take you to this website. So your ID is a username and password that actually serves as the legal signature for the FAFSA. Okay, so without the FSA ID signed by both the student and parent, the FAFSA will be, in a sense, rejected. If that happens, the FAFSA will not get processed by the college, and it could delay any financial aid award letter that is sent out. So again, this is something that both the parent and student need to have in order to successfully complete the FAFSA. All right, here's some other information about the FSA ID. Students, they'll need the ID to sign the form. If you're borrowing a loan, the federal direct loan program, you will need your ID in order to complete the required paperwork. Again, and parents, and I'm sticking with a more traditional dependent student situation here, but again, parents will need to create an ID as well. I can't stress this enough, that students and parents should not share the FSA ID. It is unique to each person. Okay. So here's a screenshot of the FAFSA. Usually it's available, well, not usually, but it's always available on October 1st of that year for the following school year. It is free to complete. There is no fees. You won't have to submit a payment of any kind. And I put on here report 2018 income. The FAFSA went through some changes a couple of years ago, and now the income information is actually from 2 years ago. It used to be a prior year, but they made some changes because a lot of families filed extensions for their tax returns or had other unique tax situations. So the government decided, well, we'll go back 2 years. That way, any tax issues should be resolved. Any extension would have passed. So for this year, we're in the 2020-2021 academic year. The FAFSA information for financials is actually coming from the 2018 income. There is an app for the FAFSA. It's available on all operating systems. I don't recommend the app. It's good, but when you're sitting down to do the FAFSA, you're going to want a large screen where there's less error, less chance of error, because all the information that will be entered, it's crucial that it's correct. So while the app is good for maybe checking on some things, I would recommend using, at the very least, a tablet or a laptop in order to complete the FAFSA. Okay, so what do we need in order to complete the FAFSA? I mentioned the FSA ID, for student and parent. Both student and parent will need their Social Security number. If the student has a driver's license, we will need the FAFSA will need that number as well. Your 1040s, as well as all the schedules and W-2s for the applicable tax year. So again, we're going back 2 years. So right now, we can actually fill out the 21-22 academic year FAFSA. So if we're using 21-22, we would actually use information from 2019 as the income. But for this presentation, we're using this current academic year just to make things simpler. You would need to find if you received any untaxed income. Child support is one that would need to be accounted for. Your assets, savings, checking, investments, real estate. You're only listing the value of your savings and checking as of the date that you fill out the FAFSA. So if you fill out the FAFSA on October 20th, you're using the information from your bank as of October 20th. You should also have a list of schools that you're interested in sending your FAFSA to. You can send up to 10 schools, okay? The school will receive your FAFSA. They will then link it up with the application for admission. And if the student is admitted, they will then get an award letter outlining all of their financial aid. Here are some errors that we've encountered that families make. The first one is, again, that Fsa Id, forgetting to submit both of the signatures. Incorrect social security number and date of birth. These are extremely important to get these right. The social security number is how the college links the application for admission along with the FAFSA, so we have the correct student. The social security numbers and birth dates for both the student and parents also go through a edit or a check by the Department of Education to make sure that all the information matches. Spelling of names, obviously, we want to get that correct because, again, if it's not spelled right, it could lead to a delay in processing the FAFSA. We would need, an error would be a divorced or remarried. It's going to ask for the year that the divorce or separation occurred. So it's important to get that correct, as well as income. I've seen a lot of situations where the parent will do the FAFSA and accidentally put in their income information into the student side. So it looks like the student is making, a salary, and this could make them potentially not eligible for financial aid. So just make sure you're looking at the correct section, because again, there is a student financial, student demographic, and then a parent financial and parent demographic. Income taxes paid, untaxed income, the household size, these are all questions that are going to be asked that if they are not reported correctly, could, again, delay processing, or the college might have to reach out and ask for additional information. When we get to both the student and the parent section, there is an option called the IRS data retrieval tool. It is voluntary. You do not have to do this, but if you allow the system to link your tax record to the FAFSA, all of that information gets automatically imported from the IRS to populate all of the income fields for both the student and parent. What this does is it really eliminates the need for a college to reach out and actually ask for your 1040. This is a very secure process that the Department of Education has worked with the IRS on for some years now to make sure that it is secure and safe. Now, if you didn't file your tax return from 2 years ago, that's fine. Or if you weren't required to fill out a tax return, you can still manually enter in the income information. So as we get through the FAFSA, remember, we're going to go through the parent section, the student section. One of the last pages that you're going to come to is called a confirmation page. Right? On there will be, as the arrow indicates, start your state application. So how this works is you fill out the FAFSA. FAFSA goes to the Department of Education. But the state of New York, as well as most other states, also have a grant program set up for students that are from their state and attending an in-school state, or in-state school, sorry. You can click on Start Your Application here. It will take you to the New York Higher Education grant application. So this is a separate application that you would need to do, but it is for grant money, which, as we saw before, is really the best kind. So I encourage everyone that at the end, and you see the button for Start Your State Application, I encourage them to do this. Here's what the New York State TAP stands for Tuition Assistance Program. Okay. Again, it is a grant that the state of New York does give to eligible students. Now, not every student is going to qualify. New York State uses the information from the FAFSA to determine eligibility, as well as information that is entered in by the student when they fill out their application. New York State also has a program called the STEM Incentive Program. You can see there the eligibility, ranked in the top 10% of their graduating high school, actually going into a STEM program. And for those of you that don't know, STEM is short for science, technology, engineering, or math. And as long as they enroll or intend to enroll in one of these programs at either SUNY or CUNY college, they could be eligible for the STEM program. There is also a contract that the student will reside and work in the field of STEM in New York State for 5 years. But the incentive is that they do get a very generous grant from the state of New York. So the applications are opening soon. So this will be the same as when you go to apply in whatever year. And the deadline is usually middle of August. Lastly, New York State also has an Excelsior Scholarship. The Excelsior Scholarship is another source of grant money. As we see here, the eligibility is the parent and student combined adjusted gross income is less than $125,000. And the state gets that information from the FAFSA. They need to be pursuing undergraduate degree at either SUNY or CUNY college, be full-time. Full-time is typically 12 credits per term and complete at least 30 credits each year. And again, there is a contract to reside in New York State for the length that the award was received. So that means you do need to be a New York resident in order to receive the Excelsior Scholarship. All right, so let's talk a little bit how eligibility is calculated. So the FAFSA information is sent to all schools about 3 to 5 business days after you submit it. As long as the student has been accepted into that college or university, the financial aid office will review the FAFSA and then make an award letter based on that information. Financial aid offices might also, as I mentioned, reach out for additional information. I've seen situations where the family would put in the same amount of taxes paid as their adjusted gross income, or they list zero income. We all know that you can't survive on zero income, so there has to be a way to prove how you're supporting yourself. So these are some things that financial aid offices may ask. Once the file is complete, we would then send out the financial aid award letter listing all of the eligible aid that the student is going to be eligible for the coming school year. So, determining eligibility, there is a award letter from the Department of Education that gets sent out to the people that file the FAFSA. It's called a student aid report. On that student aid report, and I had an example of it, next slide, there's going to be what's called an EFC, expected family contribution. Now, it's a little deceiving, the language here. The government is looking to change this expected family contribution because it can be a little misleading. But the EFC ranges from 0 to 99999. Usually that 99999 number is for students of professional athletes or, finance, where there is a very large amount of income. So what the Department of Education does is it has a formula established by law, and it considers the family's taxed and untaxed income, their assets, benefits, the number of people in the house, the number of people in college, and it's then going to spit out that expected family contribution number. All right. So we want to remember the EFC is not the amount of money you will have to pay for college. That's where the confusion comes in, because expected family contribution could be 0, but there still could be a payment or a balance due that the student would have to pay. The reason for that is every college and university varies from school to school. So an EFC of 0, you might receive enough aid to go for free at a community college or some four-year colleges. But again, this EFC range, it's an index in order to determine eligibility. To give you an example, the federal Pell Grant I mentioned earlier is a grant from the Department of Education. If your EFC is from 0 to 5,900, that will make you eligible for the federal Pell Grant. The lower the EFC, the higher the amount of Pell Grant. The Pell Grant, it's on a sliding scale. So for example, for this year, student with an EFC of 0 is eligible for a federal Pell Grant of $5,800 for the year. As you start to increase the EFC, that $5,800 does get reduced until an EFC of around 6,000. That's generally the cutoff for being eligible for the federal Pell Grant. Okay. So here's an example. This is what you're going to get after you complete the FAFSA. And you can see where the arrow is. It's going to say expected family contribution. And in this case, the student's expected family contribution is 0. Now, schools also use this EFC to determine if the student is eligible for any institutional grant money. Okay. Institutional grant money is a little bit different than federal. Obviously, federal is coming in the form of the federal Pell Grant. Schools, though, do have their own institutional money to give out to students. And this family contribution number helps them determine who gets it and for how much. So if we're looking at a timeline, the FAFSA does open up October 1st. So starting October 1st of this year, you can fill out the FAFSA. It would be for the 22-23 academic year. Okay. You're going to want to keep an eye out for emails and correspondence from the Department of Education. Sometimes they will reach out and point out that there was an error or some other information that might be requested. And it's a good thing to know the schools that you're applying to. Find out when their FAFSA filing dates are. Some schools have priority dates where the earlier you get your FAFSA in, you might be eligible for a larger pool of money. Colleges do begin to award financial aid, usually January through April. Some colleges will get their award letters out usually some November, but typically January through April is when students can see their financial aid award letter. May 1st is the national deposit deadline. So by May 1st, the student would need to determine where they're going to go and make a deposit to secure their place, not just in the class, but also to secure their place in housing if the student's going to be living on campus. So just as a reminder, here are some things that we need to get ready before we file our FAFSA. Again, tax documents, the correct Social Security numbers. The FAFSA is intuitive. It does give information next to each question on where to look on your tax return in order to get that information. So there is a question, I think it's question 7. What is your adjusted gross income? There will be a box that will open up that will tell you where to look on each particular 1040. So it does try to help simplify things. So you may have heard horror stories about the FAFSA, how it's difficult and cumbersome. It's not. I would just encourage you to take your time. A typical family can expect to finish the FAFSA 30, 40 minutes possibly. And the FAFSA does need to be completed every year because income and tax situations and living situations do change from year to year. So the FAFSA is only valid for one academic year. So a lot of times we have situations that happen in our families that just isn't captured on the FAFSA. The FAFSA is really a snapshot in time. So if we stick with our 2020, 2021 academic year, that's looking at your information from 2018. But there could have been a lot of things that happened, especially now with COVID and the pandemic. There are a lot of special circumstances when it comes to income. Medical expenses, there could have been a divorce or a remarry, dependent care expenses. So all of these things you can actually bring to the college or university. And they do have a process to take into account when there's a job loss, when there is a reduction in income, when there's unusual medical expenses. So again, all of these aren't necessarily captured in the FAFSA, but you do have the ability to reach out to the financial aid office and explain what's going on, and they will then in turn show you what forms need to be submitted, and we will perform a special circumstance to see if the student could be eligible for more financial aid based on the new information that is received. So all schools do have a special circumstance process. So just kind of wrapping up here, my advice, review the timelines. Every school has a different timeline for priority application, priority FAFSA. They might have scholarship applications that need to be filled out by a certain date. That should all be listed on the college's admissions website. Gather the materials before. You can save your FAFSA as you go through it and come back to it. But it's a best practice if you do have all of your financials, social security numbers, et cetera, ahead of time. So you can just plug in the information. Scholarship search. Good place to start is high school. Your high school counselors should have resources for students. A lot of high schools give out their own scholarships, but they should have information on where families can look for external scholarships. You'd be surprised. Places in your own town, civic organizations, churches, nonprofits. A lot of these organizations do offer scholarships, but it's up to the student to really do the legwork and go out and see what's available. There are companies out there that you can pay to assist you with the FAFSA. I would not go this route. The FAFSA is actually getting better every year. These financial and college planners do charge money to apply for the financial aid, even though it's free. So it is an option. There are a lot of companies if you look out there, but I would encourage you to really take ownership of your financial aid and for the son, daughter, and parents to do it together. That way there's less chance for error and everyone kind of has skin in the game, so to speak. Here's some information, helpful places. There's the FAFSA website, fafsa.ed.gov. Studentaid.ed.gov is a great website. There's a lot of information on there about grants, loans, everything financial aid can be found on that student aid website. College Board is also another very good website with a lot of information about colleges, acceptance rates, retention rates, programs, cost. And then finally, the website for the New York state aid application. So that kind of ends things for me. We do have some time now if we want to have any questions.
Yep, so if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask their questions or throw their questions in the chat, Brian can answer those for you.
I have a question. So I heard the date May 1st. That deadline, is that for like submitting your FAFSA to the college, or was that a different deadline, that May 1st?
Generally, there is no hard date for the FAFSA deadline, okay? It opens up October 1st. There might be a priority deadline where schools will say, well, if you get us your FAFSA by February 1st, you'll have access to a larger pool of money. The May 1st deadline is the national deadline to put a deposit down to secure the student's place in class as well as living arrangements. So that actually this year, I think that got extended because of COVID. A lot of colleges were extending their deadline from May 1st to June 1st or even later. But I have not heard anything for next year of changes. So May 1st is the national deposit deadline for all students. We have another question here. Should we fill out a TAP application if we're unsure if we're going to an in-state or out-of-state? Yes, definitely. Nothing's going to happen if you fill it out and end up attending an out-of-state school. Just remember that you cannot bring those funds out of state, and you won't be eligible for that state's grant program as well. So, for example, if you're a New York resident and you decide to attend school in New Jersey, you would not be able to take TAP funds with you, and you wouldn't be eligible for the New Jersey grant program as well. And that kind of works vice versa. So was there anything else about the FAFSA and any particular situations, family situations that might come to mind? Who to include? There is a question, number of people in the house. Generally, that is for parents with qualified dependents, but there might be a situation where grandmother comes to live for whatever reason. If she can be claimed on the parent's tax return, then yes, you could include the grandparent in the number of people in the house. But if, cousin Johnny comes and lives with you for 6 months for some reason, no, in that case, you wouldn't be able to include him in the number of people in the house. So that's one thing that kind of gets a lot of questions on. Do you see any other questions, Sophia?
Nope, I don't see any questions coming in.
Okay. Well, if that's it, I will.
It's one question. What should be used to calculate value of real estate?
Usually your tax assessment. You do get an assessment either quarterly or usually quarterly. So I would use that, what you receive from the town. Again, you usually get a tax assessment every couple of months. I would use that information. And the FAFSA, and along those lines, the FAFSA will not ask for any the value of any second home only if you're receiving income, where you might have a second house, but you're using it as a rental. But that income would be reflected on your tax return anyway, but it would not ask the value of your secondary home.
I have a question. I apologize. I did come in kind of late, but
Okay.
we do have some students that sometimes will fill out the FAFSA independent as an independent. Do you have any tips in general for students that are going that route as an independent?
Well, it all depends if they can answer or how they answer certain questions. There's generally 5 or 6 questions. If they answer yes to any one of those questions, they are considered independent. So I've seen it where, students might pay their own way, have their own job. They don't rely on their parents for anything, but in that case, that wouldn't necessarily make them independent. I've also seen it where the student moves out and has their own apartment or lives with a friend. Again, in that case, not independent. The government's pretty strict when it comes to taking into account who is dependent and who is independent. So if they are over 24, if they have a bachelor's degree, if they are a veteran, now if there's some type of a case where the student need to be removed from the house for any reason, be it domestic issues or anything related to that, we would have to see proof that the student was removed and is now living possibly with a foster parent or in some other facility where the home situation was just not healthy and the student either removed themselves or were removed by an institute. DIFUS or some other organizations work with us in providing information about a student situation. We often get information from high school guidance counselors that have information about the student and their home life. So again, just because the student thinks they're independent always doesn't necessarily mean that they are. So one of the first sections on the FAFSA are dependency questions. And those questions, how they're answered will determine if the student's independent or not. Did you have a situation you wanted to ask about? Maybe I could be a little more specific with you.
Not necessarily. I think in general, what you did say about like each situation being very unique, I've noticed just depending on the student and their background. I think sometimes it just comes down to like supporting documentation.
Yes.
Is like huge. So sometimes that does get tricky, I know, for students and just like as a counselor working with our students.
Yeah, it can get tricky and it can be sensitive because unfortunately there are a lot of times when the student just is in an abusive house, not healthy for a lot of different reasons. But we do need, and these are federal guidelines, we generally ask for at least 2 pieces of information. The first one would be a statement from the student, kind of outlining why they're not living at home or why they're living with their grandparents and not at home. And then usually 1 or 2 pieces from an organization, be it the school, a guidance counselor, a church, police reports I've seen come in, kind of outlining what had happened in a certain situation. So we do take each situation uniquely. And, there isn't one bit of advice I can give for everything other than the questions on the FAFSA. There's 6 or 7 of them. And if one is answered yes, then the student is independent, but most schools will ask for information. You may have seen in the news, there was a rash last year of students that tried to make themselves emancipated from their parents in order to be independent, that's a whole nother story. I don't encourage that. Emancipation can be tricky. Courts are involved. But that is a question that comes up. If I'm an emancipated minor, what happens? And yes, as long as you can provide information that you are legally emancipated, then the FAFSA would consider you independent.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you for the
Okay,
two
you're welcome.
documentations. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Sure.
All right. Well, if nobody has any other questions, thank you so much, Brian, for speaking with us today. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here. Again, tomorrow we have another session designed specifically on loans and borrowing, which is, can be really beneficial to a lot of people. So please come back and join us for that.